The bell rang, signaling the end of another long day at Jefferson High. Students poured into the hallway like a river breaking its banks, laughing, shoving, shouting over each other, backpacks slung over one shoulder, dreams of video games and snacks already pulling them toward the exit. But not everyone was leaving. In a quiet corner near the science wing, a man in a faded blue uniform pushed a mop bucket slowly down the hall. His name wasn't known to most students. He was just the janitor. He moved with a quiet rhythm, like someone used to being unseen. He wiped down whiteboards, emptied trash bins, and swept up crumpled papers without complaint. To the kids, he was part of the background, like the lockers or the flickering fluorescent lights. Earlier that afternoon, in Mr. Calloway's calculus class, things had gotten tense. The teacher, known for his sharp tongue and sharper expectations, had been trying to explain a tricky integration problem. Half the class stared blankly at their notebooks. One student raised his hand and asked, "Sir, why do we even need to know this? When are we ever going to use it in real life?" Mr. Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "Because it's on the test," he said flatly. Then, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, he added, "Maybe if our janitor walked in right now, he could solve it for you. Bet he's seen harder problems mopping up soda spills." The class laughed. It wasn't mean-spirited, at least they didn't think so. Just a throwaway joke, the kind teachers sometimes make to lighten the mood. But outside the door, the janitor paused. He'd been there to refill the paper towels, bucket in hand, when he heard the comment. He didn't flinch, didn't scowl, just stood there for a second, listening to the laughter echo down the hall. He finished his task and moved on, but the words stuck with him not because they hurt, but because they reminded him of something he hadn't thought about in years. Later that evening, long after the last student had gone home and the school fell into silence, the janitor returned to the empty calculus classroom. He didn't have a key, he never needed one. The door was left unlocked for custodial staff. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the desks. The chalkboard still held the unsolved problem from earlier, the numbers and symbols frozen in time. He set his bucket down gently and walked to the board. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then, without hesitation, he picked up a piece of chalk. His hand moved smoothly, confident, practiced. Lines curved, symbols stacked, variables canceled out. He worked quickly but carefully, like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Within minutes, the solution unfolded across the board in neat, precise handwriting. He stepped back, dusted chalk from his fingers, and looked at his work with quiet satisfaction. He didn't erase it, just turned off the lights and left, the only sound the soft squeak of his shoes on the linoleum floor. The next morning, Mr. Calloway walked into his classroom, coffee in hand, ready to pick up where he left off. He froze in the doorway. The board, his board, was covered in a complete, elegant solution to the problem he'd left unsolved. Not just correct, but beautifully reasoned, with steps clearly laid out, even a small note in the corner offering an alternative method using substitution. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked around the empty room as if someone might jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But there was no one. Students started filing in, yawning and groggy. One girl pointed at the board. "Whoa, did you solve that last night, Mr. C?" He hesitated. "No," he said slowly. "I didn't." Whispers spread like wildfire. "Then who did? Did someone break in?" "Maybe it's a ghost." Someone joked that maybe the janitor really did solve it, remembering yesterday's comment, but they all laughed it off. No way, but Mr. Calloway couldn't shake it. He studied the handwriting. It wasn't messy or rushed. It was professional, the kind of writing you'd see in a textbook. At lunch, he found the janitor in the staff break room, eating a simple sandwich at a small table by the window. The man looked up, nodded politely. "Afternoon, sir." Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. "Hey, I was wondering, did you go into my classroom last night?" The janitor took a slow bite, chewed, then set his sandwich down. "Just to empty the trash, like always. And, you didn't touch the board?" A pause. Then quietly, "I might have added a few lines." Mr. Calloway stared. "You solved that calculus problem?" The janitor didn't boast, didn't smile, just looked out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze. "Used to teach math," he said simply. "Long time ago." The words landed like a stone in still water. Turns out decades earlier he'd been a university professor. Brilliant, respected, publishing papers, mentoring grad students. But life had taken a hard turn. Family illness, mounting bills. A series of choices made not out of want but necessity. He'd left academia, taken whatever work he could find to keep a roof over his head. Eventually, he ended up here, mopping floors, fixing leaky faucets, invisible to the world he once helped shape. He never talked about it, never corrected anyone who assumed he couldn't read the posters on the wall, let alone solve differential equations. He did his job with dignity, asked for nothing, expected less. But something about that joke, the casual assumption that someone like him couldn't possibly understand something so advanced, had stirred something deep inside. Not anger, not pride, just a quiet need to remind himself and maybe the world that knowledge doesn't disappear just because your title changes. Word got around, not because the janitor told anyone, but because Mr. Calloway couldn't keep it to himself. By third period, half the school had heard the story. Students gathered outside the calculus room, staring at the board like it was a miracle. Some took pictures. Others just stood in silence, rethinking everything they thought they knew. A group of seniors approached the janitor later that day as he was cleaning the gym bleachers. They didn't mock or gawk. They just asked, "Is it true? You were a math professor?" He nodded once. "Can you help us with our homework sometime?" He smiled just a little and said, "If you're serious about learning, I'm serious about teaching." That afternoon, instead of heading straight home, he stayed late. In an empty classroom, a small group of students sat with notebooks open, pencils ready. He pulled up a chair, rolled up his sleeves, and began to explain, not just how to solve the problem, but why it mattered, how it connected to the real world, how math was more than numbers, it was logic, beauty, truth. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the hallway in golden light. Through the window, you could see students leaning forward, eyes wide, not because they had to be there, but because they wanted to be. And in that moment, the man in the blue uniform wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was exactly who he'd always been, someone who knew the power of a single idea to change everything. The school would never be the same. Not because of a viral moment or a dramatic speech, but because one quiet act of courage reminded everyone that greatness doesn't wear a uniform. It lives in the choices we make, the respect we show, and the belief that no one is ever just what they appear to be on the surface. A week passed and something strange began to happen at Jefferson High. Students started showing up early, not to hang out or scroll on their phones, but to sit in empty classrooms with notebooks open. The rumor had spread like a spark in dry grass. The janitor knew more math than most teachers. But it wasn't just about math anymore. Kids from all grades, even those who'd never cared about school, found themselves curious. Not because they suddenly loved equations, but because they'd seen something real, something honest in the way he carried himself. He never made a big deal out of it. Every afternoon, after finishing his rounds, he'd sit in room 214, the same calculus classroom, on a folding chair he brought from the storage closet. No podium, no fancy whiteboard markers, just a worn-out notebook and a pencil. And students came, not in droves, not like a show, but one by one, quietly, almost shyly. They'd ask a question about algebra or physics or even how to structure an essay. He'd listen, nod and answer. Not with jargon, but with stories, with patience, with the kind of clarity that only comes from truly understanding something yourself. Teachers noticed. At first, some were uneasy. Was this allowed? Was it appropriate? But then they saw the results. Test scores in lower-level math classes began to rise. Attendance improved. Kids who used to skip class were now staying late, helping each other, forming study groups in the library. Even the school counselor mentioned that fewer students were coming in stressed about failing. They had hope now. One afternoon, the principal stopped by room 214. She didn't interrupt. She just stood in the doorway and watched. A sophomore was struggling with quadratic equations, frustrated, close to giving up. The janitor didn't rush her. He leaned forward, tapped the paper gently, and said, "You ever tried building a ramp for your bike? The curve you need, that's a parabola. Same shape as this equation. You're not just solving for x. You're figuring out how high to jump without crashing." The girl's eyes lit up. "Wait, really?" He nodded. "Math isn't just numbers on a page. It's how the world works." The principal walked away quietly, but the next day she made an announcement over the intercom, not about rules or schedules, but about respect. Sometimes, she said, the people who teach us the most aren't standing at the front of the room. Pay attention, be kind, and never assume you know someone's story just by what they wear or what job they do. That simple message changed the air in the school. Students started saying good morning to the custodial staff. They held doors. They picked up their own trash without being asked. It wasn't forced, it grew naturally like grass after rain. Meanwhile, the janitor kept doing his job. He still mopped floors, unclogged sinks, and fixed wobbly chairs. But now when he walked down the hall, students didn't look through him. They looked at him with respect, with curiosity, sometimes with gratitude. And he always nodded back, never making a fuss, never acting like he deserved special treatment. But not everyone was happy. A parent called the school office, concerned. Is it safe for students to be alone with a staff member who isn't certified? They asked. Another worried that it might confuse the chain of authority. The principal listened carefully, then invited the parents to come see for themselves. They did. And what they saw wasn't a secret club or a power grab. It was a group of teenagers, focused, engaged, helping each other while a quiet man in a blue uniform offered gentle guidance. No drama, no hidden agenda, just learning. Still, the attention started to weigh on him. One evening, as he locked up the classroom, a reporter from the local paper showed up, camera in hand. Can we get your story? They asked. People want to know who you really are. He shook his head. I'm just doing my job. But you used to be a professor. That's inspiring. He looked down at his hands, rough from years of work stained with ink and cleaning solution. I'm not trying to be inspiring, he said softly. I'm trying to be useful. The reporter left, but the story ran anyway. Short, respectful, but enough to bring more attention. TV vans parked outside the school the next morning. Students buzzed with excitement, but he didn't show up. He called in sick for 2 days. He stayed home. The school felt different without him, quieter, somehow emptier. Study groups still met, but there was a hush, like they were waiting for something. On the third day, he returned. Not with a speech, not with fanfare, just walked in at 6 a.m., bucket in hand like always. But this time when he passed room 214, the door was open. Inside, a dozen students were already there working together. They looked up when he entered. You're back, one said, relief in their voice. He nodded. Floors won't mop themselves. They didn't ask for a lesson. They just kept working, and he stayed, not teaching, just being there. And that was enough. Then came the school board meeting. Some members wanted to formalize the situation, offer him a teaching position, give him a classroom, put him on payroll as an instructor. Others argued it wasn't protocol. He doesn't have current certification, one said. We can't just bend the rules, but a student spoke up. Not a star athlete or class president, just a kid who'd failed math twice before this year. He didn't bend rules, they said, voice shaking but clear. He showed us that learning isn't about rules. It's about caring, and he cares more than anyone I've ever met in this building. The room fell silent. In the end, no official title was given, but something better happened. The school created a new after-school program, open to all staff, certified or not, where anyone with knowledge to share could host informal sessions. The librarian started a poetry circle. The cafeteria worker taught basic cooking. And the janitor? He kept his folding chair in room 214. One Friday, as the sun set and the last student packed up, he erased the board slowly, carefully. The equations faded, but the impact remained. A freshman lingered by the door. Do you ever miss it? They asked. Teaching at the university, I mean. He paused, chalk dust on his fingertips. I never stopped teaching, he said. Just changed classrooms. That night, as he walked to his old pickup truck in the empty parking lot, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like himself, tired maybe, but at peace. He'd never wanted fame or recognition. He just wanted to help. And in a world that often measures people by their job titles or bank accounts, he'd reminded an entire school that wisdom doesn't wear a suit. It wears whatever it needs to show up when it's needed most. Back home, in his small apartment above a laundromat, he made tea and sat by the window. On his shelf, tucked between a photo of his late wife and a stack of old textbooks, was a handmade card from the students. It read, "Thank you for seeing us." He smiled, sipped his tea, and turned off the light. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Quiet, steady, lighting the way for anyone willing to look up. Winter settled over Jefferson High like a soft blanket. Frost clung to the windows in the early mornings, and students shuffled through the halls wrapped in puffy coats, sipping hot chocolate from the cafeteria. But inside room 214, something warm had taken root, and it was growing. The after-school sessions weren't just about math anymore. Word had spread beyond the school. A student from the next town over started showing up on the bus, notebook in hand. A retired engineer from the neighborhood began dropping by once a week to help with physics problems. Even a local artist offered to teach sketching on Fridays, saying, "If numbers can be beautiful, so can lines." And through it all, the janitor remained the quiet center, not leading, not performing, just being present. He'd sit in his folding chair, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening as students debated, laughed, or groaned over tricky problems. He never claimed credit. When someone thanked him, he'd just say, "You did the work. I just handed you the flashlight." But change has a way of rippling outward. One Tuesday, a freshman who'd barely spoken all year raised his hand during a session. "I don't get why we're learning this," he said, voice low but steady. "I'm not going to college. I'm going to work with my uncle fixing cars. What's calculus going to do for me?" The room went quiet. The janitor didn't sigh or give a lecture. He leaned forward. "You ever seen how an engine's timing works? How pistons move in perfect rhythm? That's calculus, rates of change, motion over time. You don't need the fancy symbols to use it, but knowing the math behind it? That's what turns a good mechanic into a master." The boy blinked. "Seriously?" "Seriously," he said. "Knowledge isn't just for tests. It's for life. And your life matters just as much as anyone else's." That moment stuck with everyone, because it wasn't about grades or college admissions. It was about dignity. About saying, your path is valid, and you deserve to understand the world you live in. Soon, students started bringing real-world problems to the sessions. One girl was designing a rainwater collection system for her family's garden and needed help calculating volume. A group of friends wanted to build a solar-powered phone charger and asked for guidance on circuits and energy conversion. The janitor didn't have all the answers, but he knew how to find them, and more importantly, how to teach others to think for themselves. Teachers began stopping by, not to observe, but to learn. A history teacher sat in on a discussion about statistics and polling data. The drama coach asked how geometry applied to stage design. It became clear this wasn't just a tutoring club. It was a community, but with growth came new challenges. Funding was tight. The school couldn't afford extra supplies, graphing calculators, science kits, even decent notebooks. Some students shared pencils. Others used the backs of old worksheets. The janitor noticed. One weekend, he quietly posted a small request on a local community board. Gently used school supplies needed for student learning group. He didn't expect much. But by Monday, boxes started appearing at the school's front office. Pencils, rulers, calculators, even a donated laptop. A hardware store sent tools for hands-on projects. A retired math teacher dropped off a box of old textbooks with handwritten notes in the margins. No fanfare, just people helping people. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, addressed to the school but marked, "For the janitor." Inside was a scholarship offer from a small private college 2 states away. They'd heard the story through a teacher who'd read the local article. They wanted to invite him to speak at their education conference, and they offered to cover his travel, plus a small honorarium. He read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his locker. He didn't go. Not because he didn't appreciate it, but because leaving even for a few days felt like abandoning the students who now counted on him. Instead, he wrote back, "Thank you, but my classroom is here." The college responded with something better. They created a new outreach grant named after him, not using his name, just calling it the Quiet Teacher Initiative, to fund after-school learning spaces in under-resourced schools. All because one man chose to stay where he was needed. As spring approached, the school prepared for its annual open house. Usually it was a quiet affair, parents walking through classrooms, glancing at bulletin boards, maybe chatting with a teacher. But this year, room 214 was packed. Parents stood in the doorway watching their kids explain concepts to younger students. Some wiped their eyes. One father pulled the janitor aside. My daughter used to hate school, he said, voice thick. Now she comes home talking about vectors and solar panels. She says you told her she's built for figuring things out. I needed to thank you. The janitor nodded, eyes a little shiny. She figured that out herself, he said. I just reminded her. Later that evening, as he locked up the school, he found a small envelope taped to his bucket. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn certificate that read, Official Advisor of Curiosity, Jefferson High. At the bottom, dozens of signatures, students, teachers, even the lunch staff. He tucked it into his pocket and smiled. But the biggest surprise came near the end of the school year. The district announced a new program, Community Knowledge Shares, a district-wide effort to invite custodians, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, and other staff into classrooms not just as support, but as contributors. One school started a gardening club led by their groundskeeper. Another had their security guard teach chess. It wasn't about replacing teachers. It was about expanding what teaching could look like, and it all started with one chalkboard, one joke, and one man who refused to let the world define his worth by his job title. On the last day of school, students gathered in room 214, not for a lesson but to say goodbye. Summer was coming. Some would leave for camps, jobs, family trips, but they didn't want to leave without honoring the person who'd changed everything. They didn't throw a party, no loud speeches. Just sat in a circle sharing what they'd learned, not just about math, but about respect, humility, and seeing people for who they really are. When it was his turn to speak, the janitor looked around at their faces, tired, proud, hopeful, and said only this, keep asking questions, even when no one's there to answer them, especially then. The next morning the school was empty, lockers shut, hallways silent, but on the chalkboard in room 214, someone had written in big, bold letters, Thank you for showing us that wisdom wears many uniforms. He saw it when he came in to clean. He didn't erase it, just stood there for a long moment, hand on the frame of the door. Then he got to work, mopping, wiping, organizing, like any other day. But something had shifted, not in the school but in the air, in the way people looked at each other, in the quiet understanding that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the person who shows up every day, does their job with care, and, when the moment calls, steps up without needing a spotlight. And as the first bell of summer break echoed through the empty halls, the janitor turned off the lights in room 214, closed the door gently, and walked out into the sunshine, just a man in a blue uniform, carrying a bucket, heading home, but behind him, the seeds he'd planted were already growing. Summer came and went like a slow breath, warm, quiet, full of long afternoons and fireflies blinking in the dusk. Jefferson High sat empty for weeks, its halls echoing only with the hum of air conditioners and the occasional custodian checking for leaks. But even in the stillness, something was stirring. Students didn't forget. They texted each other math problems from summer jobs. They met at the public library, spreading out notebooks on long tables, trying to recreate the feeling of room 214. Some even stopped by the school on weekends, just to sit on the steps and talk about what they'd build, fix, or learn next. They missed the quiet presence, the calm voice that never rushed, never judged, just helped them see a little clearer. And the janitor? He worked through the break, as always. But now, when he passed students in the grocery store or at the bus stop, they didn't just say hi. They asked questions. How do I calculate the slope for this ramp I'm building? Can you explain percentages again? I'm budgeting for my first car. He'd smile, pull out a receipt or a napkin, and sketch out an answer right there. Learning wasn't confined to classrooms anymore. It had spilled into the real world where it belonged. When school started again in the fall, things felt different from day one. New students arrived wide-eyed, having heard rumors over the summer. There's this guy. He mops floors, but he knows everything. Veterans of room 214 greeted them like old friends, showing them where the extra pencils were kept, how to sign up for the weekly knowledge share board, and most importantly, how to listen, because that's what they'd really learned. Not just how to solve for X, but how to pay attention to each other, to the people the world often overlooks. The janitor didn't return with a plan. He just showed up, bucket in hand, same as always. But this time, students were waiting. Not in a crowd, just a few at first, lingering after class, asking if the sessions would start again. He nodded. If you're ready to work, I'm ready to help. And so it began again, not as a program, not as a trend, but as a habit. A rhythm like breathing. But this year something new happened. The students started teaching each other. A senior who'd once failed algebra now led a small group on factoring. A quiet sophomore who loved coding set up a corner with the donated laptop, helping others write simple programs. Even the janitor sometimes sat back and watched, arms crossed, a small smile playing on his lips as a student explained a concept using hand gestures and a half-eaten granola bar. He wasn't needed in the same way anymore. And that was the point. One rainy afternoon, a teacher found him organizing supplies in the storage closet. "You've changed this place," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, they changed themselves. I just held the door open." She paused. "Do you ever think about doing more? Writing a book? Speaking somewhere? You could reach so many people." He looked at his hands, calloused, stained with ink and bleach. "I'm reaching the ones right here," he said. That's enough, and it was. Because impact isn't measured in views or followers. It's measured in moments. The kid who finally understood fractions, the one who stood up in class for the first time, the parent who cried because their child believed in themselves again. Then came the letter from the state education department. They'd heard about Jefferson High's unofficial learning model and wanted to study it. Not to copy it exactly. Every school was different, but to understand how trust, respect, and human connection could transform education from something done to students into something built with them. A team visited in November. They sat in on sessions, interviewed students, even watched the janitor fix a jammed locker while calmly explaining the physics of levers to a curious freshman. Their final report didn't focus on test scores, though those had improved. It focused on belonging. Learning thrives, they wrote, not in perfect conditions, but in spaces where every person is seen as valuable. The report made waves. Other schools reached out, not for a curriculum, but for advice on how to listen to their own staff and students. One principal flew in just to talk to the janitor. They sat on the bleachers after school, sipping bad vending machine coffee, talking about patience, about dignity, about how real change starts small. Back at Jefferson High, the sessions kept growing. A local carpenter started teaching basic woodworking in the shop room on Thursdays. A nurse from the clinic down the street came in to explain how biology saves lives. The janitor never took credit. He just made sure the rooms were clean, the chairs were set up, and the lights worked. But the students knew. And they honored him in quiet ways, leaving a fresh cup of tea on his cart, returning borrowed books with thank you notes tucked inside, making sure no one ever left a mess in room 214. One day, a former student came back. They'd graduated the year before, working now as an apprentice electrician. They stood in the doorway of the classroom, watching the current group debate a geometry problem. "You remember me?" they asked. The janitor looked up from wiping a desk. "Of course. I got my license last month," they said, holding up a small badge. "Use the math you showed me every single day," he nodded. "Proud of you." "No," they said, voice cracking a little. "I'm proud of us. Because you made me believe I could." That night, as he walked to his truck, he thought about all the faces over the years. The frustrated, the shy, the loud, the lost. Each one had carried a spark. He hadn't lit it. He'd just helped them find the wind to make it glow. Winter came again. Snow dusted the football field. Students wore thicker coats and complained about early sunsets. But inside room 214, the energy was warm, steady. On the last day before winter break, the students did something unexpected. They didn't ask a question. They gave a gift, not a plaque or a trophy, nothing flashy. Just a handmade book. On each page, a student had written or drawn what they'd learned, not just academically, but about life. One wrote, "I learned that asking for help is brave." Another drew a comic of the janitor turning a mop into a magic wand that made confusion disappear. In the back, someone had taped a photo of the whole group from the previous spring, standing in front of the chalkboard, smiling like they knew a secret the world hadn't figured out yet. He took it home that night. Read every page, then placed it on his shelf right next to the photo of his wife and the old textbooks. The next morning, school was quiet. Snow fell softly outside. He arrived early, as always, and unlocked room 214. But instead of cleaning, he walked to the chalkboard, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote just 3 words, "Keep going." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to, because by now everyone knew who it was for and who it was from. And as the first students trickled in, stamping snow from their boots, they saw the message, smiled, and got to work. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because somewhere along the way, learning had stopped being a chore and started being a gift. One passed quietly, hand to hand, heart to heart, in a school that finally understood. The most powerful teachers aren't always the ones with the titles. Sometimes they're the ones who show up with a mop and never stop believing in you.